We see daily cash grabbing via new taxes called levies, supposedly because we are cash strapped in this state, and at the same time see big project spending that does not fit with the message that we are in financial crisis. But we the people have to tighten our belt, while the government seems absolutely unaware and unconcerned of the amount of debt that it is accumulating. This in turn means that taxes, levies, fines and other penalties increase, as well as the cost of living rising exponentially, and the ordinary citizen's ability to exist well is compromised with almost every law that we pass.
This bill was written in a tortured way to make sure CBO did not score the mandate as taxes. If CBO scored the mandate as taxes, the bill dies. Okay, so it's written to do that. In terms of risk-rated subsidies, if you had a law which said healthy people are going to pay in, it made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money, it would not have passed. Okay, just like lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass. And, it's a second best argument. Look, I wish Mark was right. We can make it all transparent. But I'd rather have this law than not. So it's kind of like his reporter story. There's things I wish I could change, but I'd rather have this law than not.
By surveilling every citizen's home using census records, aerial and satellite surveillance, and even the medical records, the state of California can fine $500 per violation after Stage 1 emergency regulations were passed in July. Felicia Marcus, a chairwoman for California's Water Resources Control Board, says their reservoirs are low, and half of the state's water storage is gone.
In the winter of 2012, from about November to February, we were at what's called 200% above normal rainfall. California's funny the way we measure measure hydrology. So we say 100% is normal, and if you're at 200% above that, that means you're double normal. And we had this extreme, what we call a above normal scenario for about 62 days. And during that time period, the agencies came in under agency discretion and said, we're going to stop all water from moving from north to south during this extreme flow period. Lost 857,000 acre-feet of water. And what does that translate in real terms? That's the entire annual water supply for the Los Angeles basin. That left our reservoirs throughout the state at low levels because they weren't allowed to recharge during that high rain and snow period, and they were continually being sucked down during 2013 just to meet basic demand throughout the state. So when we went into 2014, we actually went into it in a deficit because our reservoirs were already at record lows going into a period of little to no rainfall, and now no recharge. So this is a drought on top of a drought. Our reservoirs in 2014 are at the lowest levels they've been in many cases since construction. And even when we did receive some rain and snow here in the early parts of 2014, agencies and operations, both at the state and federal level, were allowing water to move through the delta out to sea at a rate of 150,000 cubic feet per second to 250,000 cubic feet per second.
Santa Monica's City Council is in the first stages of implementing a 68-gallon per person per capita restriction for every home with 4 people. Fines may apply beyond that allocation, and Santa Monica averages 88 gallons per person per day as it is now. According to the Los Angeles Times, downtown Los Angeles is the driest in its history since record-taking began in 1877.
As Agenda 21 became more and more apparent to me, the government was now declaring war on its own citizens, and that goes back as far as 2008.
In 2009, lawmakers passed an $11 billion water bond measure that never went to a statewide vote. It was filled with earmarked pork that had nothing to do with water. Some of the $2 billion in environmental earmarks included bike trails and recreation projects for Lake Tahoe, projects to improve community sustainability, buying land for nature conservancies, for interpretive centers, education programs, river parkways, and other projects with no direct connection to the stated intent of the water bond. But the most unbelievable pork project of the 2009 water bond was $250 million to pay for removing 4 hydroelectric dams in the Klamath River that provide clean energy to residents of Northern California and provide much-needed water storage for agriculture and local communities along the Klamath River. The bond even included money to soften the economic loss to local communities impacted by dam removal. This begs the question, why in a state desperate for more water storage would taxpayers pay to decrease water storage by removing these dams?
Ladies and gentlemen, the origins of the environmental movement as we see it began back in 1968. The main purpose of this think tank was to formulate a crisis that would unite the world and condition us to the idea of global solutions to local problems. In a document called The First Global Revolution, authored by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider, on pages 104 and 105, it stated, "In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers, of course, will be caused by human intervention that will require a global response." That's the origin of global warming, ladies and gentlemen.
And I'm going to ask you half a dozen questions. Here is the first question, and Diane is going to read it out to you.
Does climate change?
Right, hands up all those who do not think that climate changes. Diane is going to tell me how many people don't think climate changes.
No hands.
So we have, ladies and gentlemen, 100% consensus that climate changes. Cook et al. 2013, eat your hearts out. Now then, read this one out too, number 2.
Has the atmospheric concentration of CO2 increased since the late 1950s?
Right, hands up all those who do not think that the concentration of CO2 has gone up since the 1950s. Diane, how many hands?
No hands whatsoever.
Another 100% consensus. Go on to question 3.
Is man likely to have contributed to the measured increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration since the late 1950s?
Hands up all those who disagree with that proposition.
No hands.
No hands. Number 4.
Other things being equal, is it likely that adding CO2 to the atmosphere will cause some global warming?
Anybody disagree with that? No. No hands again.
No hands.
Number 5.
Is it likely that there has been some global warming since the late 1950s?
Anybody disagree that there's been warming since the late 50s?
No
Once
hands.
again, no hands. Very good.
Is
And
it
this is the last
likely?
one.
Good. Is it likely that man's emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have contributed to the measured global warming since 1950?
Anyone disagree with that? Once again, no hands. Now, you may say, why have I bothered to ask these actually fairly crass questions, which are an insult to your intelligence? That is because we are all too frequently accused of not accepting any of those points. And I wanted it to be made absolutely plain to those who are watching this from afar that we are not climate change deniers. We do not deny that climate changes. We do not deny that CO2 is increasing or that we are somehow responsible for some of that. We don't deny, therefore, that we could be causing some global warming. So get that clear. Climate skeptics are not skeptical of the things we're accused of being skeptical of. And I need your help with this one, because, as you know, one of the biggest arguments against us is there's a consensus. As though this was some kind of an argument. Can we all practice that? There's a consensus. Now, Aristotle, 2,350 years ago, some of you are old enough to remember, actually said that argument from consensus was a species of feeble-mindedness known as a logical fallacy, one of the commonest logical fallacies in human discourse. They said that 97% agreed that humans are causing global warming. In fact, they say we are the cause. We would say, the only difference is we would say we are a cause. But we have 100% consensus. But look at the results of this survey of 11,944 papers in the scientific literature published between 1991 and 2011, a period of 21 years. Now, on the slide that you see there now, you will see 3 separate definitions of consensus. The first one, that humans can be causing some warming, is the definition of consensus that all of us agree with. We have 100% consensus, they only have 97%. Now, the next definition of consensus is that most of the recent global warming since roughly 1950 was caused by us. Now, on that, I suspect there will be much less unanimity in this room because we do not know what fraction of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. And yet, when Cook et al. Reported their results, they said that they had found a 97% consensus to the effect that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. That was their definition of consensus. It is the same as the IPCC's definition of consensus. It's the official definition of the climate consensus that we are responsible for most of the warming since 1950. Now, I'm not going to ask you your views on that because as good scientists you don't have one. It might or might not be true. But let us therefore look at how they managed to present what is actually a 0.3% consensus in the reviewed literature on that question as a 97.1% consensus. The first thing is they eliminated 2/3 of all the papers they were looking at on the grounds that they hadn't expressed an opinion. Now that is not normally how these surveys are done, but that's what they did. They knocked those out. Then they congregated together 3 levels of endorsement, only one of which was the majoritarian endorsement that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. They lumped that with the explicit or implicit endorsement of the consensus that we all agree with, that maybe we have contributed some warming and we don't know how much. They put all those together, and by conflating these 2 completely different definitions of consensus, they claimed there was this consensus of 97.1% that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. They said so in their paper, and they said so in a subsequent paper commenting on that paper. And it was only when my good friends David Leagates, Willie Soon, and Matt Briggs and I got together, did the math, and published a paper in Science and Education showing what the true figure was, that the truth began to emerge.
In 1992, former President of the United States, George Bush Sr. said, "Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals, and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources." I want everyone to consider what the words profound reorientation of all human society and unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources actually means.
As Americans, our property rights matter. Land, buildings, and material goods are the means by which we live. Without rights over our property, we have no rights over our very means of survival, and therefore we are no longer free. Our founding fathers knew this and declared our rights unalienable, meaning no person could ever take them away. So critical are property rights that our Constitution protects them in the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Individual rights and freedoms are 2 elements that make America exceptional. Not all nations think that way. Our Constitution says that man's rights are inherent to his nature as a man, and as such are unalienable. This is in direct opposition to the UN Declaration, which holds that man's rights are granted by other men and therefore can be taken away by men. Our common future. It is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This sounds fine, until you read the report. It states, poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems. It then blames nations like the United States for consuming too much and having too much wealth, much of it in the form of private property. The report concludes the only way to make the future sustainable is to reduce America's living standards and transfer our wealth to developing nations. Sustainable Development's political agenda originates in the UN's founding documents. This is not surprising, since many of the nations represented needed a point of agreement to rally around. The UN Charter provided that. Whereas our Declaration of Independence protects our citizens and their labor, the UN Declaration grants government the authority to withhold your property for the good of the community. To implement sustainable development in the United States, unalienable rights such as the right to property must be eroded or struck down altogether.
For everyone here tonight not familiar with Agenda 21, I would suggest that this is the beginning of your learning curve, not the end. In 1992, Maurice Strong Secretary General of the UN Earth Summit, said, "It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, ownership of motor vehicles, small electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable." Put those statements together with the previous one, and it must become clear that Agenda 21 is about controlling every aspect of our lives: how we eat, what we eat, how much we eat, how we move around, food production, the amount of food, and where we even live. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequences of every human action will be integrated into individual and collective decision-making at every level.
And I'm going to ask 10 questions this time, and all you have to do is put up your hand if you have seen a reference to any of these in the mainstream news media. And we're not going to ask you to read them out each time. All you've got to do is stop me as I flick through them, and if you see a hand going up, don't stop me otherwise. All right. So here is the fact that since 1990, the global warming, as measured by just about all the methods of measurement, has risen at exactly half the central rate then predicted with what was said to be substantial confidence by the models. How many of you have seen that published anywhere? How many of you have seen it published anywhere that it might be for as long as 17 years and 10 months that there has been no global warming at all? Once again, one or two people only have seen that. Let's take number 3. How many of you have seen it in any mainstream news medium that sea level might actually have fallen in the 5 years shown on the graph there? No, I didn't get many hands on that one. Here is another one, that both the extent and the trend in global sea ice has shown very little change in the 35 years since the satellites were looking. How many of you have seen that reported anywhere? Just one hand, I think, perhaps 2. Here is another one, that hurricane activity over the last 5 years or so has been at its lowest in the entire satellite record. No, not many hands, though, a small number over there. I think mostly to do with Mr. Gray, who knows everything. Then, he's a lovely man, incidentally. Then, how many of you have seen it reported, a recent paper, that the fraction of the Earth under drought, the land area under drought, has been declining for 30 years? None at all on that one. And that windmills can kill big game birds. More of you have seen that one. We're beginning to get through on some of these points. And then that methane has been increasing its concentration, but at below the predictions of all the 4 previous IPCC reports. How many of you have seen that? No need for a cow fart tax. Only 1 or 2 have seen that reported. Number 9, how many of you have seen it reported that there is substantial evidence in the literature, and here is one of my favorite examples, Grinstead et al., sea level rise reconstructed over the past 1,000 years, put against the original IPCC representation of whether there was a medieval warm period and a little ice age. There's a relatively good match, which means at least there might be a causative connection. That certainly doesn't match with the hokey stick graph, which I won't want to say anything more about. So has any of you seen the possibility that the hokey stick graph might be wrong, and that the IPCC's original estimation that there was a medieval warm period, a little ice age, and temperatures today are not particularly much to write home about? How many of you have seen that in the mainstream news media? Hardly a hand, perhaps no hands.
No hands.
No hands. And finally, how many of you have seen it reported that the supposed 97.1% consensus that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us is actually a 99.7% consensus that they have said no such thing? Not a single hand.
So what we're here to define tonight is Agenda 21 and how it is being implemented in your general plan.
Dixie Ray, former Washington State Governor and Assistant Secretary for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, stated, Agenda 21 seeks to establish a mechanism for transferring the wealth from citizens to the third world. Fear of environmental crisis would be used to create a world government and UN central direction. From a report in the 1976 UN's Habitat 1 conference, land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if you work hard and you exercise good financial management and invest in property, you are contributing to social injustice. In a report from the President's Council on Sustainable Development, we need a new collaborative decision process that leads to better decisions, more rapid change, and more sensible use of human, natural and financial resources in achieving our goals. And at the same time, Harvey Reuven, Vice Chair of the Wildlands Project, says individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective.
So what's going on? So that's today, right? Well, what happened 22 years ago? Where was Jerry Brown 22 years ago?
What we have to do here is to organize an entirely new political force to overcome the obstacles to environmental standards.
All the way back that way, heads of state all across the world are meeting. Jerry Brown is there right now. In fact, he's a keynote speaker on several occasions, and he's there right now. Brown said California will meet its goal of reducing carbon emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, and within 6 months will set a new goal for 2030. What do you think your general plan is all about? This. Here's what Jerry Brown is quoted as saying. So these goals, that will be more ambitious, that will require more technology, and will also require heightened political will. He's not kidding. He's saying we are taking this to another level.
Why do I say that? Because they're also going after rainwater. Yes, they've arrested a man in Oregon on the basis that he cannot collect his own rainwater. Sound incredible? It's true. Today, Jackson County, Oregon says it's your rainwater, and the country has sentenced a man to 30 days in jail and fined him $1,500 for the supposed crime of collecting rainwater on his own property. On that land, he has 3 ponds, and those ponds collect rainwater that fall on his land. Common sense would say he has every right to the ponds with the water on his property, but common sense has been all but abandoned. And here they are arguing that once it heads towards natural waterways, it's no longer your water, no longer the Earth's water, but the government's water. But the issue is, in fact, bigger than that. But I would point out, this has been in the media for over a week. I've heard the audio commentary from this guy, Harrington, and he's quoted in part as saying, when something's wrong, you just as an American citizen have to put your foot down and say, this is wrong. You can't just take away any more of my rights from here on in. I'm going to fight it. As you well know, they're going after everything from backyard gardens to lemonade stands, raw milk, Amish growers, Amish dairy people, you name it. They're coming after individualism in this country because they're pushing collectivism. Now, according to Oregon laws, one must obtain a permit in order to have a reservoir. But Harrington had the permits for the reservoir. In 2003, he was granted the permits, but the state reversed the decision, then come along to seize his rights to collect water, and now we're putting him in jail, which he's basically going along with as an act of civil disobedience, as an act of saying, if you're going to be a tyrant, then you be a tyrant. But why is this a bigger issue than just rainwater collecting in Oregon? Well, it's because since at least 2010, they've been doing it throughout the Southwest, many western states. In this previous article, collecting rainwater now illegal in many states as big government claims ownership over water. Another Mike Adams article. He points out how many western states, including Utah, Washington, and Colorado, have outlawed individuals from collecting rainwater, calling it an unlawful diversion of rainwater. What turning of natural rights, of common sense, all on its head, and claiming that government has the default rights to something that comes naturally on the earth instead of an individual. That's the reverse of the way the Constitution was written and understood, where all rights are kept to the people and to the states except those very few that are enumerated and specifically given to the limited federal centralized government. All that has turned around over these centuries, and now collectivist big government assumes the right until you're proven innocent, until you're proven to have some kind of individual right for something as necessary and basic to survival as water. But it just freaks me out that they could tell us we can't even collect rainwater on our own property. Total invasion of property rights. So you can see whether it's privatization where they want a monopoly of profits or the state where they want a monopoly of power, they're not interested in individuals having an alternative, in this case to rainwater, because it cuts into their domination.
J. Gary Lawrence, advisor to President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. This segment of our society, who fear one world government and UN invasion, through which our individual freedoms will be stripped away, would actively work to defeat any elected official who joined the conspiracy by undertaking Agenda 21.
In order for Governor Brown and Republicans who wanted to increase the state's supply of clean and reliable water to gain the support of environmentalists in the legislature, millions of dollars of environmental pork had to be added to the measure.
So we will call our process something else. We will call it comprehensive planning or growth management or smart growth. We ended up with sustainable development. The redeployment of human and financial resources has now become visible to us all via the cut to services and programs to assist the sick, the young, the elderly, and of course the creation of another level of poverty now identified by the term the working poor.
It all sounds so civilized, doesn't it? Here's the less politically correct but more accurate version. A group of liberals with more money than many governments have just decided how many people will be permitted to live. This group of self-appointed governors will now have to draw up criteria to be used to decide who will not be permitted to live and how they will die. It can and will be dressed up in polite and civil terms, but in the end, it means certain people will have to die.
We're constantly paying for so-called services that we don't receive. This is wealth redistribution at the grassroots level. Everyone needs to remember, we all pay a natural resource management levy on our tax rates. So this is not just going to affect the food producers. The intrusions into our property that Peter was talking about that land producers are going through will roll out into the suburbs and into the city because they have the authority to do that.
Who has read your general plan? Because I think that's an admittance of something, huh?
This government has been working overtime to take away our rights to common law through many pieces of legislation. Common law is what guarantees us an ability to correct injustices. It also ventured into the rights of people to own and retain their property and manage it without government interference. In particular, the laws around, as Peter said, water allocation, natural resource management, the Native Vegetation Act, Development and Planning Act, which are all equally toxic to our food producers as they are to our long-term security, we city dwellers. This coming year, I promise you, you will also hear debate over a number of pieces of legislation that will further erode our common law rights.
It is true, a lot of the water is in the north and a lot of the people are in the south. That's why my father passed Proposition 1 on the 1960 ballot, and that's been a marvel for California. It's created jobs and abundant agriculture. It's made California #1 in fruits and vegetables. But we've got a problem here. We have a delta system that protects the fresh water that goes to the farms, that goes not just to Southern California, but to Alameda County and to Santa Clara County. And that salt water is only protected by dirt levees. We have to find a way to make sure the conveyance through the Delta will withstand an earthquake or rising sea level or extreme weather events. And that's why for 50 years people have been trying either a peripheral canal or tunnels or some other kind of conveyance. We now have a plan. And the plan is going through the environmental impact process. Very extensive, 75,000 pages of analysis. It's not cooked yet. We're still taking comments. So over the next year, we will go over that. We'll look for if anyone else has another suggestion. But I'm telling you, the way we protect the water in the middle of California and in the South, while balancing what is right for the North and the water rights of the Northern California rights holders, it's going to take something like the Proposition 1 that will be on your ballot.
I'm very concerned about the tunnels. $25 billion for these tunnels, and the Obama administration has serious concerns. Look, if you look at Governor Brown's legacy of infrastructure projects, take the Bay Bridge, many $billion over budget, many years late. If that's the track record, this thing is going to cost $50 or $75 billion by the time we're done with it. I'm an aerospace engineer. When I look at a big engineering project that's way over budget and way over delay, I have real concerns about mismanagement. I'm not going to plow ahead with $25 or $50 billion into the tunnels. We're going to put a brake on that, study it, make sure we get it right.
This has been on the table for 50 years.
Okay.
If that salt water intrudes, half the water to Silicon Valley will disappear in a matter of days. And that would be a catastrophe for the economy of California. And I don't think this man really understands what's at stake.
The Obama EPA is saying that your tunnel program is fundamentally flawed. That's your own president, President Obama, who's saying that, not me.
Doesn't make it right, by the way.
Governor Brown has said we need CEQA reform, the environmental laws that are stymieing business investment. And then you threw in the towel, Governor. You said it's too hard, it can't be done, it's God's work, but we can't do it. So instead, you try to give one-off deals to big companies that hire high-priced lobbyists.
The reason is climate change is a global challenge. It's an existential threat to our way of life.
What this means is that every region will now be responsible for finding its own water source, and private companies are ready to sell. In Southern California, the renewable resource company Cadiz has tapped an aquifer that sits beneath 34,000 acres of the Mojave Desert. With 6 utility companies already eager to buy, Cadiz has the necessary permits to start drilling and proposes piping 16.3 billion gallons of water into the Los Angeles basin.
Make no mistake about it. He's raising your gas prices, you at home. He's raising your gas prices to fund his vanity project. Make no mistake about it. I'm an aerospace engineer. I believe in the science behind climate change. His plan is designed to raise the cost of electricity for working families, to raise the cost of your gas prices, to try to make alternatives more competitive. It is not fair to wall up working families by raising their gas and utility prices. And then the insult to injury, he's taking the money from that program to fund his high-speed train, which the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, has said will not do a thing to help the climate. Look, all of these policies are well-meaning, but this is why jobs are leaving the state. This is why we have the highest poverty rate in America, 24% poverty. How can that be this great state? It's because we've done this to ourselves. It's about, what about the kids in California? We have finite resources. Who's going to stand up for the kids in California if the governor of California refuses to fight for them? You had a choice between fighting for the civil rights of poor kids and fighting for the union bosses who funded your campaigns. You sided with the union bosses. You should be ashamed of yourself, Governor.
But the real problem here is that not enough water reservoirs are being built to supply the amount of people who move to California every year. And if the state turns off the water, then how are residents and agricultural businesses going to survive? Zachary Taylor, a state assembly candidate running for California's 46th district, believes the answer lies within the free market.
I think we can usher in an age of awareness by showing people that they have the ability to make gains on their ability to conserve water.
This November, California will vote on a water bond officially named the Water Quality Supply and Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014. With the state facing some of the worst drought conditions in decades, a water bond to fix the problem seems like a good idea. You might be surprised to learn how much of this water bond is actually drowning in environmental pork. Of the $7.5 billion bond, only $2.7 billion is directly allocated for new reservoirs and other water storage projects. The next largest allocation is $1.5 billion for environmental pork projects to protect waterways and wildlife. 10 conservancy agencies will have access to $298 million that has nothing to do with increasing water supply. In fact, the Coachella Mountain Conservancy plans to use $10 million in water bond money to preserve hills and sand dunes between Palm Springs and the Salton Sea. The San Diego River Conservancy plans to use $17 million for bicycle and pedestrian trails. And the Water Quality and Supply Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014 includes money that can be used for dam removal on the Klamath, a direct contradiction to the stated intent of the bond measure.
Look, we don't have money, it doesn't grow on trees. And as a result of that, we're only spending $2.7 billion on water storage. When Republicans and Democrats said we should be investing in schools, Governor Brown said no. Again, if we're spending $70 billion on the train, it crowds out all these other investments that we need to make. But my commitment to the people of California, if I'm elected governor, I'm going to cancel the high-speed train, and I'm going to invest in water in a very real way. You know, Governor Brown's own father led a major infrastructure investment in water all around the state. He understood, Pat Brown understood how critical water is. If I'm elected governor, I'm going to invest in water, not the train, because water and schools have to come before the high-speed train.
Unfortunately, the limited funding in this measure dedicated to infrastructure for water storage will only increase water storage in the state by 1%. It's shameful that environmentalists are using the state's water crisis and this bond measure as a tool to mislead voters to fund projects the state can't afford and doesn't need. California desperately needs new water storage. But we don't need a bond measure that is drowning in special port projects and may actually decrease water storage in the state if dams on the Klamath River are removed. That's common sense.
But here we are now, openly talking about Agenda 21 and the ramifications we will see in a short period of time if this is not stopped in its tracks. Up and participate in the democratic process, and to do that you need to understand the political system that you are trying to rein in. 1972 published the alarmist Limits to Growth document, warning of worldwide overpopulation, the need for sustainable development. This was the beginning of the slow process of social engineering and programming people to accept that the planet is struggling to sustain life. On the 8th of October 1973, the New York Times reported a quote from Ted Turner: "The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history." In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev said, "We are moving toward a new world order, the world of communism, and we shall never turn off that road." He also quoted in 1996 Monetary and Economic Review on page 5, "The environmental crisis will be the international disaster that will unlock the new world order, one world government." In 1992 came the Earth Summit, which produced the document called the Earth Charter. This document was co-written by Maurice Strong, long-time globalist, elitist, and Mikhail Gorbachev. Both Strong and Gorbachev stated that it was hoped that this document would be adopted as the new 10 Commandments, with environmentalism as the new one world religion. Out of this summit came Agenda 21. Ted Turner was quoted as saying in 1996, "The total population of 250 to 300 million people is ideal. That means a reduction of 95% from present levels would be even more ideal." Anyone who abhors the China one-child policy is simply a dum-dum. In 1998, the Baltimore Sun reported on July the 7th, most of Ted Turner's first donation to the UN of $22 million went to programs that seek to stall population. Another goal of the depopulation process is that the upcoming generation will submit to sterilisation to save Mother Earth.
The world is going more and more deeply into a general breakdown crisis, which would probably result in the elimination, within a generation or two, of 2/3 of the present level of the world's population.
So one thing that we're learning is that fluoride is virtually in everything. That's why it's so imperative to get it removed from our community, because it's not just our tap water that's contaminated, but the majority of these products contain fluoride. The problem is anything with water in it has this toxic chemical in it, fluoride. Does that frighten you? Does it alarm you?
That's really scary, especially since I have a newborn here that's living off formula.
So whether it be milk, juice, mustard, ketchup, cereals, it's in everything. When you water your plants with tap water that is fluoridated, the plants take it up, then you end up eating it. You can't boil it out. Distilled water has fluoride in it as well. You can't evaporate it out. The only way to get it out is to have it turned off.
We took with us in our documentary in China a little fluoride tester from the Lamotte, L-A-M-O-T-T-E, Lamotte company. It's called an ion-specific electrode.
One thing we should do, Paul, is maybe go see Dave Kennedy and get that fluoride tester.
Good idea. Then we can test all the products.
Let's test all the products.
So
this is Deagle.com, and the information that you're about to see is absolutely mind-blowing. As you can see here, Deagle takes their information from a lot of government links and sources. Deagle lists pertinent facts for 209 countries, including gross domestic product in U.S. dollars millions, military expenditures, the power purchase parity in U.S. dollars, as well as the U.S. dollar. And we have 209 countries ranked. What you're going to see here for the U.S. is going to blow your mind. As you can see, we got U.S. 2013 information, population 316 million, 33 inhabitants per square mile, a gross domestic product of $17 trillion, and a military budget of $726 billion. Let's go down to the forecast for 2025. What do we got? How did we get from 316 million in 2013 to a forecast of 69 million in 2025? How are we going to be going from 316 million inhabitants in 2013 to 69 million inhabitants forecast for 2025? Now, for those who think this is some kind of mistake, we can go check out some other countries. We're going to go ahead and look at China. China goes from 1.4 billion to forecast for 2025, 1.4 billion. Our concerned reader is from Norway. Norway is interesting as well. In Norway, they expect the population to drop from 5.1 million to 1.9 million, a GDP drop of 516 billion to 73 billion. What's going on here?